Cynthia thinks that the Congressionals had Dr. Reba retired from the project the moment they discovered its potential.
Mark, how much do you know of the organization I work for?
The Illuminati?
Recently, Sunrise published a Western CGI animated Gundam series called Requiem for Vengeance. To be blunt, it's not very good. On a related note, the live-action Gundam movie changed its director and abandoned Netflix. So with both of these in mind, it had me thinking about the first time we had a piece of Gundam media created almost entirely outside of Japan. Not War for Earth, though I promise you we will get to that someday. I'm talking about the Canadian made-for-TV movie G-Saviour, released in December of 2000 after a lengthy 5-year production. I've known about G-Saviour for years, but I always put off watching it. I knew it was going to be bad. Sometimes you really do just know from looking at something. But even still, I wanted to give it a fair shot, because unlike a lot of people I've talked to, I don't hate the idea of live-action anime adaptations. Obviously, you've got your Netflix Death Notes and your Cowboy Bebops to sour the idea, but it's not impossible to make a good adaptation. Anime and live action are both mediums, and I don't have anything against adapting one to the other. Where I do take issue with the concept is when it's portrayed as if live action adaptations are needed to legitimize something or make it for mature audiences, when animation is already perfectly capable of that. But I think that sentiment has faded more and more with time. To give a good example, not only do I think the Rurouni Kenshin movies are good, they improve on the source material in some ways, and cut unnecessary fluff in others. The same goes for Japanese animations of Western properties and vice versa. I don't think making a Gundam anime outside of Japan is doomed to failure. Plenty of people in the West love these stories, and they understand them, and they fully are capable of getting them. This doesn't mean that when I hear the words Western live-action Gundam, I'm not filled with overwhelming fear and dread, just that when I do stop to think about it, I'm fine with the concept. And it's especially interesting considering Gundam Wing had only just started airing on Toonami that year. In the West, Gundam still wasn't nearly as big as it would be. It's genuinely shocking that this movie exists. Everything about it says that it shouldn't. Let me get this out of the way right now. G-Saviour is not a good movie. Though with that said, I won't deny that there is something kind of charming about it at times. It's a low-budget sci-fi movie from the end of the 90s, and there's something about that I can find endearing. It kind of makes me think of the Dune miniseries, but if it was made by Eiffel 65. If you want to see it, it's short. It's only an hour and a half, and you can watch it on YouTube. But to be blunt, the most interesting thing about G-Saviour is discussing it, not actually watching it. And it's for that reason that there will be spoilers in this review. Lots of what I know about G-Saviour is entirely thanks to Zeonet Stanlations, the same guys who translate really everything to do with Gundam. Seriously, I can't stress enough just how invaluable Zeonet Stanlations is, especially with finding info on the production of this movie. I've linked their article in the description, and I would highly recommend reading it if you're interested. So before we talk about the movie itself, let's start with how it was made. This was surprisingly difficult to try and get information on because G-Saviour is not a popular part of the franchise, and finding any information on it is a lot harder than you think. But after reading a bunch of articles, I think I've pieced together a pretty decent chunk of its history. So in 1995, Toichi Inoue founded a branch of Sunrise called the Digital Image Development Offices, or DID, and he would be named its director. The company would be an experimental team created with the purpose of seeing what they could get up to with new technology, and one of these experiments was trying to make 3D models of mobile suits. Around the same time, Mobile Suit Gundam: The War for Earth was in development for the Mac. Well, actually for the Apple Pippin, but close enough. There we go, Intrigued. It was an interactive movie that blended CG animation with live action footage. Inoue saw this and went, boy, that sure does look like shit.
Your father killed to become the ruler of the Duchy of Jean.
Char, you craven traitor!
But he also saw potential in the idea, and in April he went up to Sunrise and proposed a live-action CG piece of Gundam media, and sure enough, Sunrise was on board. The mobile suit designs would be done by Kunio Okawa, one of the most legendary robot designers in the industry, best known for designing the Zatu 2 and the original RX-78-2 Gundam, along with many of the Gundam's later iterations like the Mark II and the Ground type. The artwork for the setting would be done by Shigemi Ikeda, who sadly passed away last year. People don't always know about his contributions, but he was a big part of why the world of UC is so memorable, with him having done the world design for Double Zeta, CCA, 0080, along with many others. He was one of the biggest contributors to Gundam as a whole, along with being an incredible artist in his own right, so having him on board was a great start. Then there's the issue of the CG part of CG live action. Initially, Inoue went looking for a Japanese studio, but the infrastructure for this kind of animation in Japan just wasn't really there yet, so he ended up visiting the United States and eventually Canada in search of a studio. By the end of the year, he had it narrowed down to 2 studios, and the one he went with was Digital Muse, a Canadian studio. The decision to partner with Digital Muse was won over by 2 things mainly. The first was that, unlike their competitors, Digital Muse used the same software as Sunrise, which would make working together much easier. The other is that one of their founders, John Gross, had previously been in charge of the CG on Star Trek, so it seemed like he'd be a good fit for portraying a series that takes place in space. Inoue would go on to give lectures to the staff on the Universal Century setting, along with showing videos on the series that he'd edited together to give samples of civilian life, the world, and the way mobile suits interact with it. Actors who played pilots would also be given master grade gunpla of their respective suits to give them an idea of what they'd be piloting. This was jarring to a lot of the Canadian staff. Most of their experience with science fiction had been flashier, more extravagant. The more grounded and real tone of Gundam's world was a change of pace for them, and originally the story was going to be similar to the very first 1979 series. The protagonist would be a high school boy who ends up piloting the titular Gundam, with his supporting cast being mostly of a similar age, and the antagonist being an evil ruler who had taken over the colony of Side 4. This would eventually change around 1997. Sunrise made the decision to release G-Saviour in the year 2000 as a part of the Big Bang Project, a 20th anniversary celebration which would include the releases of Turn A Gundam, Mission to the Rise, a remastered release of the original series recap movies, and of course G-Saviour. Coinciding with this decision, they decided to retool the story into something for older audiences. The idea was that since this was for the 20th anniversary, the story would be aimed at 20-somethings who had seen the original series when they were younger, rather than a new audience. The cast would all be adults similar to 8th MS Team or Stardust Memory, and the plot would be shifted from an evil empire to an environmental story, taking inspiration from real-world concerns like mass famine and climate change. So when they began hiring more actors and production crew on the Canadian side of things, Inoue only had one request. They had to be people who knew nothing about Gundam. Oh no. Though he did also say that if they did know Gundam, then they had to like some of it. Finally, in January of 1999, filming for the live-action sequences would begin, and after a hectic month of constant work, it would finish. And on December 29th of 2000, G-Saviour would finally be released. G-Saviour takes place in 223 Universal Century, though honestly, you could put it on its own timeline and nothing would change. The Earth Federation has collapsed and the colonies are now autonomous. Zeon kinda got what they wanted, funnily enough. It just took a while. With the Federation gone, there are now 2 powers that control the world. The Congress of Settlement Nation, also known as Consent for some reason, and the Settlement Freedom League. Overpopulation and food shortages are rampant. Kind of weird considering the whole point of the colonies was to deal with food shortages, but we gotta keep this moving. Our main protagonist for this story is Mark Curran, a former mobile suit pilot from Consent who left the service out of guilt after failing to save another pilot. Nowadays, Mark works as a mobile worker pilot in a research facility deep in the Atlantic Ocean. After the facility is seemingly attacked by terrorists, Mark steps in to prevent an unarmed intruder from being gunned down mercilessly, only to find out that he's suddenly being given credit and congratulations for a capture that he didn't do. And surprisingly, a lot of this story doesn't take place in mobile suits. In fact, it's actually got a pretty emphasis on the mystery, intrigue, and politics, which I don't necessarily mind. Obviously, I love the robots, I didn't build all of these for nothing. But I actually think it's really interesting how much of this movie focuses on the world itself over the robots. This goes to a strange extent though, we'll get there. After talking to the prisoner, Mark discovers that what's essentially happened is that while Consent is suffering from a global food shortage, the neutral space colony of Side 8, also called Gaia, has made a breakthrough in bioluminescent technology that would allow them to grow plant life underwater, vastly increasing the space for growth. I guess they can't grow plants on one of their 5 space colonies they control. I mean, if you need space for growth, I don't see why not space. It can't be done. It can't be done. There was no time. This is a strange issue because there's an easy solution here to make it a bit more believable. Just don't say that Tencent controls several of the colonies. In fact, not just several, they have most of them. Just make Tencent the Earth government instead. Unicorn would later go on to use a similar idea for Full Frontal's plan, with the explicit mention that Earth can't sustain itself and without the colonies they would fall into mass starvation, sort of like what we see here. Well, I say see, sort of like what we're told here, although we don't really see any evidence of this. Anyway, the corrupt officials in Tencent want this technology, so they frame Mark as a murderer, and they do a comedically horrible job of it. This interview is hilarious. The corrupt officer chasing Mark might as well be Zap Brannigan the way he handles this whole thing. Even the reporters don't really believe it at all. It is handled with the utmost of both confidence and incompetence. So anyway, the movie is about Mark being on the run to try and deliver this new technology to Side 8, along with Cynthia Graves, the daughter of the leader of this neutral colony. Look, it's just Canadian Kadali from Seed. It's weirdly similar. He also brings along his fiancée Mimi, who horribly regrets having to be here, but who is this group that he's working for?
Mark, how much do you know of the organization I work for?
The Illuminati?
What?
Just what I've heard from Cynthia.
Well,
There's something horribly wrong about this, and I can't put my finger on it. Secret societies are fine. Name-dropping the Illuminati is where my suspension of disbelief collapses. Something about this just doesn't fit. By the time you get to Universal Century, most of the old world is seen as myths, folklore, history. This is way further past than that even. Anyway, Mark works with the Illuminati. The terrorists he worked with aren't terrorists, but rather scientists and volunteers from Daya, trying to stop their creation from being suppressed by Consent. I also find it really funny how at some point they stopped saying bioluminescent technology and they just call it bioluminescence. Like, wow, bioluminescence is real. Yeah, it is real, you're right. And we learn a little bit more about Mark during this time. Essentially, back when he was a mobile suit pilot who used to work under the Dai hunting him, during a training exercise, he saw someone falling into the atmosphere and was told not to save them since he'd die as well. He initially followed orders, but after 30 seconds he gave in and tried to help, but it was too late. So part of what haunts him is not knowing if he could have saved them if he acted sooner, and it was this incident that caused him to retire and go into civilian work. You know, honestly, I don't mind this backstory. It kinda gives him a better reason for his pacifism than some characters. If we compare him to, say, Kira Yamato in the later parts of Seed, then I honestly think his goals of pacifism are a bit better written at times and more believable. Mark isn't a horrible protagonist. It's hard to call anything in G-Saviour well written, but for what it is, he's decently likable usually. So when they get to Gaia and Tencent is planning to invade and take the MacGuffin by force, Mark is given the G-Saviour, and it is incredibly anticlimactic. Despite being the namesake of the movie, the G-Saviour basically has nothing to do with anything. It could be entirely cut and nothing would change. And this is where we lead into a slightly harsher point.
There is no one section, it's just the vibe of the thing.
There's something that bothered me throughout all of G-Saviour that I couldn't quite put my finger on. G-Saviour just doesn't feel like Gundam, but I couldn't figure out why. And I don't think it's because they reused the uniforms and props from Starship Troopers either. This happens in the novelization too for some reason. It's kind of hard to quantify what exactly makes something feel like Gundam, because Gundam has such a wide variety of settings and premises that it's surprisingly difficult to narrow down what doesn't fit. I mean, Witch from Mercury had a stool setting and that didn't feel out of place, so what's wrong with G-Saviour? It even has a lot of the signatures of the setting, with the more grounded designs, the emphasis on old world military uniforms and aesthetics in a sci-fi setting, the political and environmental themes. In fact, it's actually got some surprisingly close parallels to Gundam Seed despite the fact that it came years earlier. And I think the reason is kind of foreshadowed by the title. The word Gundam is never said in the entire movie, not once. You might have noticed, this isn't Mobile Suit Gundam G-Saviour, it's just G-Saviour. I've thought about this a lot, and at the end of the day, I think it really is just the vibe of the whole thing. Again, I think you can make a good Gundam in the West, but there's nothing in G-Saviour that benefits from being Gundam. It shoehorns in some mobile suit fights, but honestly, everything involving the actual mobile suits feels forced. The G-Saviour itself is irrelevant. People like to pass around the image of, wow, cool robot, missing the point, but I think this is the next extreme of that. It focuses so much on trying to build intrigue and make a mature story that it forgets that mobile suits do matter. Mobile Suit Gundam is, believe it or not, still kind of about the mobile suits. Think about the R-78 and the amount of power it puts in a child's hands. It's vital to Amuro's development. And at the end of the series, when the R-78 is no longer the top dog and there's better suits, it's where Amuro's ability to persist really comes out. What the Gundam represents and what it means is important. The Easy 8 is a strapped together Gundam made from whatever they had lying around because the war has gotten so desperate. Etsia is a symbol of what Setsuno wants to be in 00, and what he sees in it changes as he does. The reason G-Saviour doesn't feel like Gundam to me is because it completely takes this aspect of its world for granted. The mobile suits don't mean anything, they're token robots, there's no need for them in the story. And on the opposite end, you could do something with the grunt suits, make them feel like metal coffins, death traps, but it doesn't do that either. There's just nothing besides some good designs and competently choreographed fights. Which leads me into the next point.
They left me in a world of darkness without your sexy hands, and I'm...
G-Saviour is actually not the beginning of this story, believe it or not. Sunrise wanted it to be a multimedia project, and to that end the movie is actually the middle of the trilogy. First was an audio drama, which to my knowledge has never been translated. Third was a video game on the PS2. I've heard it's surprisingly good, but I never played it. So at the end of G-Saviour, it's revealed that the Die Hunting Mart doesn't actually want the MacGuffin. He wants to destroy it because it's easier to control the population when they're starving. That doesn't really make any sense, but let's keep this going. After a pretty decently animated fight, they get the MacGuffin, and the main antagonist and also Mart's fiancé blow up, but it's fine, he doesn't really care. And the movie ends with Mart deciding to turn himself into consent for his crimes. It's kind of shocking just how little happens in this movie. You might think I skipped things, but no. It's a short movie and not much happens in it, and what does happen isn't particularly well written. It's not funny bad, not usually, it's just not that great. I said earlier this looks like a cheap early 2000s sci-fi movie, and the writing does reflect that. The dialogue is trying very hard to be campy and charming, and to their credit, the actors are trying very hard, and they're doing a decent job at times, at least with what they're given. And I also think it's worth mentioning that several of these actors did in fact go on to work on more Gundam projects. Nuka Okuma, who played the lead scientist for Daya, would go on to voice Lady Une in Gundam Wing, and this random pilot from the last fight would actually go on to become the dub voice actor for Athron in Seed and Tieria in 00. Most of the actors are still working today, and some of them especially have had some surprisingly big roles. As for Inoue, he would go on to supervise MS Igloo, but he would eventually leave Sunrise afterwards. I once had G-Saviour described to me as an hour and a half of a man desperately trying to cheat on his wife, and it's not wrong. The dialogue is serviceable, it's not grating, but it's also not really interesting. Random bits of drama like Mart cheating on his wife happen out of nowhere and are essentially never brought up, and there's really never any kind of regret or repercussion. It's just something that happens to keep the plot moving. But if the plot won't give me more to work with, let's talk about these mobile suits. Back in my 0080 and 8th MS team reviews, I was really more of a fan of Gundam's plot. I didn't get much into the designs of the mobile suits, or really care that much to be honest. At some point though, I finally took the plunge into Gunpla, and that really did give me a new appreciation for these designs. As I mentioned earlier, the designs were done by Kunio Okawa, one of the most important figures in Gundam's history, and you can still see some of his style here. The G-Saviour itself is a really nice design. It's got that classic look that evokes the idea of the RH-78 and the Zeta while still being distinctly modern. These fins on the legs and the waist really make me think of something like a modern jet. It feels a little newer. And while it's hard to tell because of how absurdly ugly the movie is, I do like the muted color scheme it uses, though I think the V-fin should have been dulled. It blends in a little too much. The shoulders sort of remind me of the F-91, though its canonical proportions seem off on the technical front. It's just slightly shorter than the Zeta at 18 meters, which doesn't really track with late UC suits like the F-91 and Victory being smaller, but at the same time it weighs an entire 140 metric tons. The Sazabi is almost twice its size and it weighs less than half. I can only guess this is a mistake, like the Potadets being a madman's ravings. The game's model shows it off much better without the horrible blue filter. I don't think the director of the movie realized that, shockingly, there's actually a lot of sun in space. Space isn't just night. A more traditionally colored version of the G-Saviour would later appear in Build Fighters, only to be quickly destroyed as if struck down by Tomino himself. As a side note, I tried to find what Tomino thinks of G-Saviour. General consensus is that he hates it, and articles say that he publicly decried it at the Big Apple Anime Fest 2002, but I've never actually found any proof of this, so take it with a grain of salt, and if you do find proof then please do let me know, I'd be interested. Besides the G-Saviour, I'd also like to mention the Freedom. Not that Freedom, but this one, which is Daya's main grunt suit and essentially a successor to the old Jims. Consent uses the Budu, which is essentially a Zaku type, which I think fits well with the Federation and Zeon having slowly become more and more indistinguishable, like how the Titans used the Hyzat. Now both are gone and we've got Consent, which essentially is both. The Rye, piloted by Mart's former boss, is also kind of okay. I'm not huge on it. It kinda looks like the St. Healy. Just to be thorough, I should mention the soundtrack as well. G-Saviour's music is alright. It's not super memorable. It was composed by John Debney and Louis Febre, both great composers who've done far better work afterwards. I mean, he went on to compose for Passion of the Christ. I don't know how they got him in here. The PS2 game soundtrack is also pretty sick. I wouldn't listen to it regularly, but honestly, it's pretty good. I tend to prefer it. But with that, I've successfully talked more about G-Saviour than probably anyone in the last 10 years, and I'm eager to stop. This movie isn't great. It's not horrible. I kinda wish it was worse so I could have more to say and it would be funnier, but I do think that there are some interesting stories in its development, and there are ideas in here that could be salvaged for better shows. The fact that it exists is fascinating. A Canadian made-for-TV movie spinning off of an anime is just fascinatingly bizarre, and for that reason alone, I won't deny that there is something that kept me interested in it. If nothing else, I can say this: I was never bored while watching G-Saviour. There was always something that had my attention. If you do want to watch it for yourself, it's available here on YouTube for free. Nobody cares enough to take this thing down anytime soon. But that's it for me. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
気持ちが抑えられない。あなたは未確認生命体、異世界の果てまであなたが好き。